Now, I'm skipping over, because of time, I'm skipping over, for those, you're going to have to read this in the book, the college years, which are, there might be questions, you can ask me that. Very important, two regards. I went to the University of Wisconsin for two reasons. One very practical reason, I was terrible in math, and the University of Wisconsin in Madison did not require undergraduates to take math. You can get a degree, so that was one reason. Being very honest here. The other reason, it was the only campus in the United States that had an open Communist Party club on campus. And I was, as I told my first girlfriend in a romantic ride over Manhattan and the Staten Island ferry, that I'm going to devote myself to building the Communist Party and being a leader of American communism. And of course, Wisconsin was the place we could go to do that, because they had a Communist Party club on campus, then called the Labor Youth League, which was the name of the Young Communist Organization. And in fact, what we did, well, I don't really want to talk about it because I want to get to the two main things where I changed, but just one little thing about what we did as young communists on the campus. The Communist Party, true to the stereotype of what people said about it, infiltrated other groups to try and direct them. We really did. And it worked. We had the presidents of our secret communist group. There were open members, and I was an open member. But nobody else knew the bulk of the members. They all were secret. There were public spokesmen and the secret members. And we had the presidents of the students, what was it called? The Students for the Young ADA, SDA. President of SDA, supposedly liberal Democrats, was a communist. President of the Young Democrats was a communist. The president of the Film Society was a communist. We carefully went into and won leadership positions in almost every student group that we could. And it paid off, because one of the things we did that got big publicity is when the Attorney General's list was created, the McCarran Act, there was a big so-called amicus curiae petition to the Supreme Court against the McCarran Internal Security Act, signed, it looked very impressive, by all the liberal leaders of these different student groups, when in fact we had written it and they were all communists, but nobody knew that. So that's the way it worked. And eventually, communism fell apart. We formed the Socialist Club. I became involved in the early New Left. I got my doctoral dissertation under William Appleman Williams, who was most well known as a Cold War revisionist, and started to move in that different kind of circle of the intellectual New Left that still believed in socialism but had broken with the old, crude, communist Marxist-Leninist version. Now I want to get to the three, skipping way ahead, and when did we start? 15, 20 minutes do I have? The three big episodes that really began to change how I looked at the world. In the mid-1970s, that late, I finally had the chance to go to Cuba. And you have to realize that Cuba was for us the Holy Grail. I mean, Fidel Castro, a young man in his 30s, 1959, took power in an authentic, dramatic revolution. The bearded guerrillas fighting against the authoritarian Batista dictatorship. Fidel was close in age to us. This was the heroic guerrilla, someone who was going to create a new society, not communist, not capitalist, but humanist, green. He had all this rhetoric. And we took as our slogan what C. Wright Mills wrote in his little book, Listen Yankee, where this American sociologist purported to speak to his fellow Americans as the voice of the authentic Cuban revolutionary. Mills, in his introduction, said, "I do not worry about the Cuban Revolution. I worry with it and for it." And that's the way we saw ourselves. So finally, in the 1970s, I'd always wanted to go to Cuba. And I finally had my chance. I went on a tour organized by the Center for Cuban Studies, which still exists. That's the main Cuban propaganda group in the United States, Cuban government propaganda group, run by Sandra Levinson, who just sponsored a big concert for Fidel in Carnegie Hall by Harry Belafonte. If you don't care about it, don't go to see Harry Belafonte at Wolf Trap, by the way, because if you want to make a private political protest, I mean, he's one of the big Fidelistas still around. His concert was just this past year. And we went to Cuba with a group of, I don't remember, 12 or so, highly committed, ultra-revolutionary types. One of the people was the late African-American novelist Tony Cade Bambara, a very nice person, I remember, but another one was the husband of Janetta Cole, who I had met then. Janetta Cole, as you know, became the president of Spelman College and almost became head of the education department under Clinton till it became exposed and her appointment was withdrawn when her communist views were publicly exposed. So I went to Cuba, and there's nothing like being exposed to the reality of really existing socialism for a month to begin to sow doubts. And I mean, it was an incredible experience. I mean, I was there for four or 5 weeks, and it was incredible. I mean, a couple of examples. We went to Santa Clara to a refrigerator factory. And they were very proud of the fact that now they have some new light industries that never existed before. They were building refrigerators. And we went to the factory, and we walked through this factory without air conditioning in a hot Cuban climate. This was in August, by the way. It was burning hot. And it was like snowing asbestos. We said, what is this? We went through these fumes. And we couldn't breathe, and we were coughing, and we said, what is this? And they said, this is asbestos. They looked around, all the people working in there, none of them had masks, they had no protection. And we said to them, I mean, it was too obvious. I said, you know, they don't even wear masks. These people aren't going to be around in 10 years. Asbestos causes cancer. Everyone knows that. He said, no, it's safe, or Fidel would never allow this to take place. So that was one thing. We went to the cigar factory, famous Partagas cigar factory, there since the 1870s or 1850s. And they made, the reason the cigars are so good, because they roll them the old-fashioned way, by hand. They sit with a cure the tobacco. It was all done by hand. They explained they couldn't use, even if mechanical processes were involved, they couldn't use them because the quality would be affected. So these were workers, and it was just like the famous cigar things. They're rolling there, sitting there, working by hand, and one person's chosen to be the reader and reads the communist newspaper aloud to them, so they don't waste their time. They have something to hear. And they were told, you know, that's a major item for export, because it was a poor country. They needed to export and sell those cigars. And they said, they explained to us that, I don't have the figures in front of me, but they had to do so many cigars. And we raised the obvious question, well, what happens if that's too many, they can't meet that quota, it's just too difficult, what do they do? Does the union speak up and say, you know, we can't, we have to have a slower, more doable number? And they said, no, absolutely not. If the party knows how many cigars have to be made, then they would work 12 hours a day, or they'd work all Saturday and Sunday, because it has to be met. And I said, what about the union? Well, of course, the union is there to be the transmission belt, to have the demands of the Central Committee and the Economic Planning Committee tell them what to fulfill. So there was nothing like workers' rights. And the last thing that really was astounding was the trip to the mental hospital. Now, this was a showcase mental hospital. Acres and acres of grounds with its own baseball stadium, absolutely beautiful. A few wards, but mainly individual units with 3 or 4 patients living together. And, you know, very impressive. Nice furniture, even air conditioners in the room. It was lovely. I mean, if I had to be in a mental hospital, I'd want accommodations like that, no doubt about it. And a couple of things happened at the mental hospital that were astounding. One is that it was clear that in that period, many homosexuals were put there because they were found to be homosexual, and that was defined as mental disease, and they were therefore committed. The second thing I found is we found a lot of patients looked like walking zombies. They were totally spaced out. They looked, and we figured heavy doses of tranquilizers, which is, you know, and it was disturbing. I mean, you couldn't converse with them. They looked like they were really in another world. And then the doctor, the head physician, who had talked to us afterwards, and he said, we are very proud the fact that we have more patients lobotomized in this institution than any other institution in the world. We have the highest percentage of lobotomies. And this was amazing. I mean, one of the members of this group I was traveling with was from the so-called Radical Therapist Collective somewhere in New York. And he said he was very upset. We came out and going back to the bus, he said, I'm really upset. He said, this is everything I'm fighting against in the States. How can they lobotomize these patients? This is barbaric. This is horrible. And a woman in our group, Suzanne Ross, later the founder of the Committee in Solidarity with the People of Central America, CISPAS, she was one of our group. She looked up and glared at my friend Larry, who had just complained about the lobotomies, and said, you have to understand that there's a difference between capitalist lobotomies and socialist lobotomies. Well, that shouldn't be surprising. This is a group who wanted us to meet before each breakfast and get together and start the day by singing the Internationale to give us the right spirit for the day. So Cuba opened up a lot of doubts. In fact, I came back, and for a left-wing magazine, I tried to deal with my doubts. I wrote a long piece for Dave Dellinger's magazine, Liberation, which was pacifist, left-wing socialist magazine, about the trip to Cuba, being very critical of some of the things I've just told you about. And the result was an onslaught of attacks from the rest of my traveling companions, who said we went on a different trip, that I was serving the ends of American imperialism and anti-Soviet propaganda. The communist historian Philip S. Foner said, the worst thing the Cuban Revolution has done is to let the paws of Ronald Radosh get on Cuba. I mean, it was, I was really attacked. Bear in mind that I thought I was doing a service to the revolution. I still believed, as somebody in Russia used to believe, if only Stalin knew. I said, if Fidel only knew, a report by a friendly critic like me would get back and it would help them understand what changes they have to make. But it sowed seeds of doubt. The second thing was the Rosenberg case. Now, I started working that way back in 1978. And a long time ago, the book came out in 1983. I first started with my friend from graduate school when I went for 1 year to the University of Iowa. I started with Saul Stern, and we started working the case. And in 1979, we published a preliminary article in the New Republic. And again, essentially, I won't have time to get into all the details of the story, but and I've told it many times before, and a lot of you may, know a lot of this, but essentially, and eventually my later co-author, Joyce Milton, who has spoken to this group also, we reached a conclusion that Julius Rosenberg was in charge of a major Soviet espionage network, that his wife Ethel Rosenberg didn't do anything herself, but was fully aware of what was going on and was an accessory, and that in fact there was a larger network that was never detected. And this was really a case not of suppression of civil liberties, but of a case involving Soviet espionage. Now you have to bear in mind that when I wrote the Rosenberg file, even in 1983, I still considered myself very much a man of the left. At that point, I was no longer the pro-communist left, but I was still in the democratic left. In fact, I was a member by then of Michael Harrington's organization, which was first called Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and then Democratic Socialists of America. And I believed that whether or not a left was going to be built in America, it didn't have to be built on the myths of something surrounding the Rosenbergs. And I quickly found that this, too, was going to get me in a lot of trouble. Now, the attacks were never-ending and vicious. I mean, I've been called every name in the book. I would be called in the middle of the night, woken up by people, condemning me as a traitor, and even worse. The other response I got, one of my friends from the Madison New Left, who had been an editor of studies in the left and then the founder of the journal Socialist Revolution and then the newspaper In These Times, was Jimmy Weinstein. And Jimmy Weinstein, who I give him great credit for this, came to the defense of the Rosenberg file when it was published and said it was correct and stuck his neck out and was hated for a lot of people for doing that. But aside from Jimmy Weinstein, who actually led me to carry out the investigation, because he was the one who said he had information that indicated it's not just simple black and white. They may have been involved in something. And his telling me the story of his own story of his involvement in that case led me to really start exploring the case. But even I looked through old letters for this memoir. And even Jimmy Weinstein wrote me that he was getting disappointed with what I was doing because, I'm quoting from his letter to me, that I was not portraying the Rosenbergs, quote, sympathetically. He wanted me to write a book, and again I'm quoting his words, that show the Rosenbergs' espionage as entirely in the best interest of the American people. And he concluded by saying, the problem, as he sees it, was that I was beginning to slip into anti-communism in the bad sense. And this was someone who was defending me. Another friend, another historian, who I knew from the New Left, Mark Nason, wrote me a letter. And this really summed it up. This was a guy who was friendly with, who I'm still, I think, on friendly terms with. I mean, he's a nice guy. He was a new leftist, not from the old left. And he wrote, he was an SDS type. This is after my New Republic article. He wrote to me, the Rosenbergs knew how to die. They knew how to sacrifice for their comrades. It is no accident like people like the Rosenbergs fought the Scottsboro battles, built the unions, put their bodies in the line. They were patriotic. They spied for a better mankind. And he ended up saying, you must turn away from liberal anti-communism or you will put your intellectual tools in the service of the right. This was the response I got. These were from the best elements. If I said what the evidence showed to be true, in this case, that the Rosenbergs were guilty, that meant indeed that I was serving the ends of the right. Most of the other people were much cruder. They said, we don't care what's true and what's false. We need the Rosenbergs as heroes. They have to be innocent. You can't do this book. You shouldn't do it. And what really upset me, remember, I was on the Democratic left then. If you look at my original introduction in the 1983 edition, it came out again in 1997 by Yale, a new edition. But back then I said that I was a man of the left. I did not want to resurrect the Cold War. I was not trying to create a new witch hunt. I was trying to tell the historical truth. And there was no interest in this. I went to people for blurbs. And two of the people I went to were my comrades, Irving Howe and Mike Harrington. Both of them refused to have anything to do with it. Irving Howe turned away from me, said, I want nothing to do with this. Not a peep. And Irving Howe was somebody who I had always considered, and many of the SDSers in the New Left considered a fierce anti-communist. He had written an influential article against the New Left, perhaps the first anti-New Left article, called New Styles of Leftism, which even today, if you read it, is a devastating article. And here's Irving Howe wanting nothing to do with it. Mike Harrington, charming guy who I liked a great deal as a person. Very few people, except maybe Josh, didn't like him. I thought Mike was a wonderful, warm guy. I thought the world of him. Mike said, look, I always knew the Rosenbergs were guilty. This is nothing new to me, but I can't give you a blurb. We're trying to recruit former communists who still believe into our movement, and if I say anything good about your book, we'll never get them in. It was all a case of this is the movement. He was shifting to the left. He had to woo the pro-Soviet left, and he couldn't be bothered with lending his words to something he knew to be true. He then said very begrudgingly, the only thing I'm willing to say is if people attack you, I'll say I don't consider you a McCarthyite. I mean, all these things, as he began to teach me lessons, it began to let me see what I had so long not wanted to see, that the whole intellectual edifice of the left was based on a lie, and nothing you could do could change that. They could not accept things, even if they knew something was true. Even the best elements wanted to continue with the lies. with my friends on the left. I was editor of a book published by Grove Press, one of the great left-wing houses, called it was something like Central America, the New Cold War. And it was meant to be a text for use by the anti-interventionist opposition movement. And I became very involved in the issue, particularly defending the guerrillas front group in El Salvador, and not paying that much attention to Nicaragua. But essentially, of course, the Nicaragua Revolution took place, and you had to begin your focus of turning to look at Nicaragua. And I had the chance, I was fortunate enough to be sent to Nicaragua first by the New Republic in 1983, before the Rosenberg File came out, then again in 1986, and then many other times as well, with Nina Shea, who was then running the Puebla Institute. And essentially what happened, it became like deja vu of the Cuban experience. Here was supposedly the left claiming there was a new, authentic, indigenous, humanist, democratic revolution led by the Sandinistas, who were a true, authentic third force, that were not communists, that were leading a popular democratic revolution. And when I first went there in 1983, I disagreed with those on the political right who said it already was a Leninist totalitarian state, but I said I could see elements of the leadership who wanted it to move in that direction. Eventually, going through Nicaragua and being very involved there, I ended up opposing Congress when they cut off Contra aid, and ended up supporting legislative aid to the Contras as the only way to pressure the Sandinistas to change and allow change to come to Nicaragua. So I have a long chapter about my experiences in Central America. And to close, I just would like to quote one thing which I use in the book from the great writer Arthur Koestler. And Koestler wrote, someone who had been through the same kind of thing decades earlier. Arthur Koestler wrote, "Clinging to the last shred of the torn illusion is typical of the intellectual cowardice that prevails on the left." I used to think it was impossible to go on living without holding such illusions. And now I've come to the conclusion that the opposite is true, that you can't be free unless you get rid of them once and for all. And very fortunately, and highly ironic, last November, while you were voting in this election here, I had voted by absentee ballot because I was in China for the State Department and the Public Diplomacy Program, lecturing all through China on the issues in the American election and the democratic system in this country. And I was the first American ever to be invited to speak to the Central Party School in Beijing. Now, the irony of that was, to me, truly amazing. Here, I, who started out as a communist, and now considered myself a fierce opponent of the communist system and all its ramifications, was lecturing on the meaning of American democracy to whatever high cadres and training were in that audience at the Central Party School in Beijing. And I thought that experience really was a most fitting end to my personal journey up to this time. Thank you.